All right, friends, in this chapter, we're going to explore the idea of sound reinforcement and look at the system components within a typical church AV system, and really most audiovisual systems, sound reinforcement systems that are out there. So why does good sound reinforcement matter? Sound reinforcement is, in its essence, taking sounds, capturing signals, and making them louder so people can hear them better. It's a critical piece for us because most of us aren't in the ideal acoustic situation, right? Actually, I don't think such a thing exists in the sense that there is no acoustic that does equally well for speaking as it does for congregational singing, as it does for liturgy, as it does for having a live band with amplified instruments. So it's really a series of compromises that we have to make to help tell God's story well and effectively. But the basic idea of sound reinforcement is to make in a more audible fashion what comes from the platform or from the chancel. So that's what it does. That's simply its function. And we can also use these things to create different soundscapes with better systems to create kind of different feels for what we're looking for in audio. So that's what we're looking at. All kinds of notes here. Our job with sound reinforcement is to be able to tell God's story in a clear way so that all people are able to hear what's happening. I mean, there's nothing worse than not being able to fight through a sermon because you get this terrible ring in what we would say is like the 10 kilohertz area or the 6 or 500 kilohertz area, which is again a way of describing particular sonic frequencies. But you've had that experience where you've been in the middle of someone speaking and you can't hardly understand them. You're completely isolated from the experience because you're focused on the terrible sound quality of the amplified voice. Same is true for if we hear mixes of a band, for example, and all you can hear is bass and low bass drum, or the guitar amplifier is blowing out everything else. And so sound reinforcement is critical to the worship experience. And of course, context is key in really knowing what is appropriate for where you're at. A sound system, for example, in Westminster Abbey, really just needs to do the work of helping to enhance the spoken word. Whereas in a contemporary context place, for example, it's got padding all over the walls. We've got to work for creating a balanced sound over a wide variety of instruments. So knowing your context is key. And I will say that none of us live in the land where we just have the money tree in our backyard, right? But being able to have a professional come out and analyze your system, analyze your room. That's generally money, and tune up your sound system, especially if you have one already in place. Equally more important if you're using volunteers, which most of us are, myself included, often. To be able to have them tune up is worth its weight in gold. Just as we would make sure that we tune pianos and organs and all of that wonderful musical piece, we need to do the same thing with our sound systems so that our people can hear God's story in a clear and effective way. So let's talk about the components of a sound system. The first piece that we're going to look at are speaker components and speaker placement. So when you come into the worship center at Grace Avenue, you will see on this, for example, in this upper picture here, what we call a line array sound system. Now, a line array system has speakers that create what we call a stereo image. So there's speakers on the left and speakers on the right, and these are what are called a line array. So it's a variety of speakers that are attached together on one side, on two different sides, and they create a stereo image. So this is especially useful in contemporary contexts. For example, if I'm running as a guitar player a digital delay, I can pan one side of the delay to the left side speaker, and then the other part of the delay can pan to the right side speaker. And so the sound bounces back and forth between the two speakers, and it provides a really, really rich sound. Right? Now, in the contemporary context, line arrays generally work very, very, very well. When you go into the sanctuary, you'll look way up in the ceiling, and you'll see these three speakers that are put together, and that's called a center cluster, and that is a mono way of having sound. So the sound just comes out of one place, which can be a very nice way of doing things if you're in a more traditional space. If you have a very vibrant acoustic, that's a good option. And perhaps the best option excuse me, easy for me to try to say, The best option and a really wonderful acoustic is what we call a distributed system, which has speakers that are placed in key points throughout the venue. You see this often in cathedrals. They'll take these long column speakers and they will texture them and put them on columns within the church, and they're timed to account for the delay. So again, your three primary ways of placing speakers are what we call the line array, which you'll see in the worship center, and the center cluster, which is what you'd see in a sanctuary, as well as a distributed system. All right, so those are our major speaker placements. Now let's talk about speaker components. There's functionally two different kinds of speakers, and they're powered. That's not really true. Let me say it a different way. There's two different ways of powering speakers. The first one, because all speakers require power for them to work. The first one is what we would call an internally powered speaker. You'll see those in the worship center. You'll see little blue lights at the bottom of the speakers in the line array. And that lets you know that the amplifier that takes the signal and powers it and pushes it through the speakers is located inside of the speaker itself. In the sanctuary, however, we have externally powered speakers. So they take the sound signal from the mixing board, put it into an amplifier, run it through cables, and then that powers the speaker that way. What's nice about externally powered speakers is if you have a problem and you kind of know what you're looking for, you can isolate the various components in your troubleshooting. But internally powered speakers are great because they are compact. They generally work very, very well, and everything is in one place. So you got a lot of different options there. There's also another speaker I need to talk about, which is called a sub. In our sanctuary, you will see these what look like almost like portholes in a ship underneath the chancel area, and in those little holes are subwoofers, like they're 8 to 15-inch size speakers in the sanctuary. You'll look in the middle of the worship center and you'll see a big black box in the ceiling in the middle, and that is an 18-inch subwoofer. And those handle the lower end sounds. Like, so for example, most of the bass comes through the subwoofer. Then we have sort of regular size speakers, woofers if you will, that capture the mid-range and some highs, and then tweeters, which capture most of the higher sounds. So while line arrays and center clusters are what we call directional speakers, they have to be pointed correctly to create accurate coverage for the people in the congregation. A subwoofer is non-directional, so you can put it in a variety of different places that work best for your room. Now you have a variety of ways of connecting the mixer and or the amplifier to the speaker. So you'll see on the left hand side the silver plug. That's what we call a speaker cable. It's specifically a 1/4-inch speaker cable. Now if any of you are guitar players or you know guitar players or bass players, they also have instrument cables, which are also a 1/4-inch. A speaker cable and an instrument cable are not the same. They don't handle each other well. So you can't use an instrument cable in place of a speaker cable. You can't use a speaker cable in place of an instrument cable. The good news is they are generally labeled on the rubber that goes around the wiring inside speaker or instrument. And then on the right hand side you'll see what we call a speak-on cable, which is a very specific cable that's designed to transfer power between an amplifier and a speaker. And speak-on cables are very, very good cables, very secure connections in a way that a 1/4-inch isn't. But you just have to look in the back of speakers to know which one is which. Now you'll see in the middle picture there, that is a relatively simple audio rack that has an equalizer, two equalizers, a power amp, a compressor, and I believe a crossover there as well. We'll look at those things a little later. So how do we get sound from the platform, from the chancel, to the mixer? Now we're going to talk about here is what we call how do we capture the signal. So you've got a signal source, for example, a microphone or a DI box that, say, a guitar player would plug into. So what happens is the microphone either plugs directly into what we call a snake, a junction box, which is where you plug in the XLR cable or a 1/4-inch cable, depending on your connections, and then that transfers the sound signal from the microphone to the mixer. Same thing with what we call a DI box, which is a direct injection box. What that does, it's that center picture you see labeled ironically direct box, that takes a 1/4 inch signal and converts it into a balanced and unbalanced 1/4 inch signal, which you don't really need to know that, I suppose, but to a balanced XLR signal. So let's talk about cables that we kind of have frequent use to. On the left and right side of the screen, in the bottom part of the screen, you will see XLR cables. You've got what we call male and female ends. You can kind of figure out why those are called that. And then we have, now we usually use XLR cables most frequently for microphones. Then we have the 1/4 inch cable, which is what you saw earlier, a 3.5 millimeter cable, which is the same size you use a headphones, like for example on your iPhone, and then often USB cables. So these are the ways in which we capture signals. So they go from, for example, the direct box into what I said, the snake or the junction boxes. You can see this particular picture here is on the floor of the sanctuary. So you can see the inputs that you plug in that sends it through the snake, which is this long series of cables all put into one larger cable, which runs back to the mixer. Right, now the function of the mixer, or if you would like to be a little British, they refer to mixing boards as audio desks, or it's also in a studio setting as well, is it allows us the opportunity to mix the sound. So we can in real time change what we have going out from there into the speakers. We can balance things that way. We can also EQ them. So, excuse me. In a minute, we're going to go through the basic layout and also talk about digital versus analog boards, which is a big piece at the moment. So as you're looking at this picture of the mixer, this is the mixer at Grace Avenue, and I would encourage you after the services to go and look at them. You will see we've got large, what are called faders, strips that come in and down, and all the black ones, for example, are individual channels. All right. So, for example, if we put a microphone into one, you use the fader that goes up and down to control the mostly the fine tuning of the volume. The red knobs in the middle are what we call bus units, which we're not even going to get into that. The 3 yellow ones are our master volumes. So we have. In this particular case, we have Coral monitors cut into the wall, and so one of those yellow channels goes to power the Coral monitors, and that sends what you've got in the black ones all the way into the main hearing of the venue. The one in the middle goes towards the main speakers, in this case the center clusters, and the one on the right goes to our live stream feed. Right, so that's the just kind of the general, very basic outlet. We'll look at what's called channel strips here momentarily. Now, there is a wonderful new phenomenon of digital mixers that are on the market that are increasingly very, very good for very, relatively speaking, inexpensive prices. We have both a digital mixer, which is in the worship center, and an analog mixer, which is in the sanctuary. Now, one of the nice things about analog mixers, if you've had folks that have run sound for some time, they're generally laid out the same way, so volunteers who have some sound experience can get around on an analog board with very minimal learning curve. A digital board, on the other hand, once you spend some time with it, you can get around in a very similar way. One of the things I appreciate about digital boards is that you are able to save settings for different services, and then you can do what's called locking them out. So, for example, in the worship center, we have a 5:30, a 9:30, and an 11 o'clock setting on the board. And what that means is we preset for the room the general area in which all the knobs need to be for that particular service. So what's wonderful about that is it gives us a good baseline for volunteers. I've got a book in each space that says how to work the general functions needed on the soundboard. And so, for example, if we have someone who's a volunteer doing the 9:30 service, then a volunteer who's doing the 11 o'clock service, they can get in the same ballpark of where they need to be relatively quickly. So that's a wonderful thing for volunteers. You can say the same sort of thing with weddings, funerals, have some ways in which you can empower volunteers for ministry. All right, the next piece that we're going to look at on the mixer is what we call the channel strip. All right, so you can see the picture on the right has, I hope I'm saying this correctly because I'm going to add the pictures in later. You see all the different color buttons, or knobs rather, right? So if you look at the very top, there is actually is a red button. That is for what we call phantom power. There are some microphones that require power to be sent from the board to them to work. So if you have got, say for example, something turned up and you're not getting any sound out of it, it might be because it requires phantom power. So that's that top red button. And red buttons, things that are painted red, are generally done so for a reason, right? You need to be aware of them. So the knob that is below that, the only red knob in the channel strips, minus those two on the far right, is known as the gain knob. Now the gain knob is painted red because you can have that's where all the power is really in the board. It's not in the faders, but it's in the gain knob. And generally, it's good to have a professional or someone who has a general idea of what they're doing to set that and then forget it. Mark it and forget it. So you don't have folks messing with the gain structure, because when that knob gets turned, that's where bad things begin to happen, because it's very, very powerful. It determines the amount of power going of a particular signal going to the faders. So we want to be very, very aware of that. Now, as you look down at the green and blue knobs, those are equalization knobs, and they're set to particular frequencies. So the higher the frequency, the higher the pitch is at the very top of those knobs. The lowest ones are on the bottom. It kind of makes sense, right? And so often you'll need to be mindful of EQing particular things. And the thing I would tell us as musicians is that we all have wonderful ears. So that's how I've been taught, is that you have a great ear. So go ahead and mess with it until it sounds the way you want it to sound. Often in many situations we need to what we call roll off, take out bass frequencies, because of the way in which our architecture is built with standing waves and whatnot. And so we do that by, it works in a clockwise fashion. So if you turn the knob counterclockwise, you're taking out frequencies or reducing them. If you turn the knob to the right, clockwise, it's adding more of that frequency to the signal. Okay, so a lot of that is just using your ears and hearing what sounds good. Often if we get like a ring in a speaker's voice, I've found that the 10K and the 5K area, pulling those out helps quite a bit. If you're having a hard time understanding someone's diction or speaking voice, adding a little bit more of that upper to higher end helps kind of make the sound crisper. But a lot of it is just learning it as you go. Now the yellow knobs, you'll see underneath the green knobs. The upper ones are buses. We're not going to get into that, as I said. That's for a totally different course. If you'll give me 1 second, quick thing of water. We have what we call auxiliary buttons. Those are those yellow buttons. And what we do with the auxiliary buttons is that allows us, as I said, you've seen the streaming, remember the yellow faders in the middle? That allows us to add sound to those particular buses, excuse me, to those auxiliary units. So if we need to get a little bit more, say the piano and the choral monitors, we would do that through the aux, through twisting that knob in the same way. Clockwise gives you more, counterclockwise gives you less. If we need a little bit more in the live stream because the mix isn't very good, the same idea. Then you see the brown buttons at the very bottom there. Those are for panning sounds. Now in the sanctuary we can't do that because we have a mono center cluster speaker structure. In the worship center, we can pan. So for example, if I were to turn one of those brown knobs to the left, it would send the signal to the left speaker. If I turn it to the right, it would send it to the right speaker. So that helps you get a fuller stereo sound. Now, as you look at the bottom of the channel strip, you'll see a white button with a red light next to it. That is the mute button. All right, it's pretty important to know. So that if you press that button, it will not send signal to the speakers. It completely mutes it. Now there's two kind of schools of thoughts of running sound in church. One is that you set the fader, which is that black knob there, excuse me, the black piece that goes up and down. You set the fader where you want it and then you mute and unmute. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is that you leave things unmuted, but use the faders to bring the sound up or down. My experience has been that generally, newcomers to sound prefer to use the mute button. People who've been doing it for a long time, the pros, use the fader because it allows you to be a little bit more artful in the ways in which you sneak people in and out of the general mix. All right, so then we have a gray circle button, and that's called the PFL button. So if you have headphones connected to your mixer, if you press the PFL button, it will just send that one channel into your headphones. This is a great way to make sure, for example, the preacher's wireless microphone is turned on and you're getting a sound from it before they get up there and you're able to troubleshoot quickly. It's also good, I found, for if I'm trying to mix vocals, like if there's a vocal trio or quartet, I can hit the 4 PFLs and mix them that way. Generally speaking, however, though, we don't want to use headphones, but just for when we're doing fine adjustments with the PFL button, because the sound that comes out of headphones is not the sound that's in the room. So if you have folks who are working sound and you see them with headphones a lot, I would encourage you to gently encourage them to use their ears more than the headphones. Underneath the PFL button, you'll see a little black oval, and within that there are a variety of lights, and these are meters. So green is good, yellow it gets a little bit worse. If you get a lot of red, that generally means too much signal is coming through that channel, and that is where we can use our gain knob, for example, to kind of fine-tune that a little bit. Sometimes if it gets in the red occasionally, you probably will be just fine. But if it stays in the red, or what we call peaks out in the red, that's generally a sign that there's too much gain coming into that channel. But generally, of course, you use your ears. Now, again, those black pieces of the plastic that we talked about, you see 2 blue ones on the right side of the screen there. Those are our faders, and that's what we use to fine-tune the sound. When they're all the way down, no signal is coming through to the speakers. You'll see a white button in the middle of the strip there, if you can locate that. And there's a line there. And generally we want to start our faders up near the top at that space, and that's what we're called unity. And there's kind of a whole concept behind that we don't need to get into today. But that's generally a good place to begin. And then we talked about this idea of using faders or using the mute button. We also talked a little bit, of course, about digital versus analog. There's in the mixers, there's some folks who believe that analog boards sound better. The main piece in listening to the sound of a mixing board is generally in the preamps, right, which is what amplifies the sound before in the board before going to a larger sound. And there's an old school way of thought, which I think is probably actually right, that analog mixers have better sounding preamps on the whole. But with the newer digital boards, they sound marvelous. So there's that piece to consider. Next, we're going to look at auxiliary components. These are components that help shape and massage the sound after the mixer. So for example, what you're looking at here, we've got a compressor, a limiter, an EQ, finer EQ, and power conditioners. So the function of a compressor, it's this marvelous piece of equipment. A lot of guitarists and bassists use compressors on their pedal boards. You'll find compressors in every studio on earth. So what a compressor does is it compresses extreme signals. So what it helps to smooth out sounds. If you get a really loud piece of signal, it helps to taper that off to make it a little bit not quite so spiky. Right, is maybe one way to think of it. And so there's various ratios of compression and lots of schools of thought about how to use them, but that's what it does, right? So then underneath that you'll find a limiter, and a limiter works in a little bit slightly different way, a little less musical way, in the sense that it is mindful of really loud spiking in volume, which is important because it'll help to protect your system, because you can blow out speakers, you can destroy equipment with too much signal going through it. And then we have underneath the limiter, the top part is the compressor, and then a limiter, and then you see the wide variety of movable knobs, movable sliders. That is a secondary equalization unit. And you can see on the left side of the unit, these are called rack mount units. You will find that the sliders are all the way down, meaning that frequency is taken out. Same thing on the high end. So you can see there's kind of the great mid-range there of those being pulled up on that lower part of the EQ. And that helps to eliminate extreme high and low end sounds, which is uncomfortable to the listener, that hurts intelligibility. And then underneath that, we have what's called a power conditioner. And a power conditioner is simply something that when you plug it into the wall, you then plug the other rack mount units into the power conditioner. The power that comes to us from electrical companies through our grid is not consistent. It is not, you don't generally get a very consistent flow of power. So the power conditioner helps to regulate that, and also in case of extreme spikes, or if your building gets hit by lightning, which has happened to us multiple times, or the power company sends the wrong kind of power through your unit, which has happened to us as well, it saves your equipment from being destroyed by those changes in power. Okay? I would like to share with you another piece that I think is really, really important. It's called a real-time analyzer, or a spectral analyzer. And what that does, you can see here, this is a digital one that's loaded into a digital mixer. It allows you to see what in your room, it's got a microphone, a sensor that comes out of the machine. In this case, it'd be an external component with a digital piece that listens to what's happening in the room and points out which frequencies you're having trouble with. So, for example, you can see in the middle that one green, very, very high spiked frequency. With a real-time analyzer, we would have the opportunity to see which frequencies were being overrepresented in the room. Then you can correct them on your board. So it's a really, really helpful way of making the sound better quickly through your EQ. You can also use it to what in professional engineers call ringing out a room. In which you do not want to be in there when they do that, because what happens is they pump an extreme amount of pink and white noise through the sound system, and then use a real-time analyzer to basically tune the sound system to the room. So as I said at the beginning of this chapter, that is an exceptionally good thing to do, once every few years, once a year, if you're fortunate enough to be able to do that, to have a professional come in and ring out the room and make sure that the system is remained to be tuned for what, to specifically to your room. Okay, I hope that makes sense. A few more pieces. We also have things that are called crossovers. You can see pictures of crossovers there. And what the crossover does is it helps to send specific frequencies to specific speakers. So for example, it sends the low ends to the subs, the mid-range to the woofers, and the high end to the tweeters. So it's an important piece, and again, a professional engineer can help you set that up. But if you're having just everything just kind of sounds weird, it's a good idea to look there to make sure, like what happens in many churches, we don't leave things locked up because we don't want to be inhospitable, and then folks come by and just get the best of their curiosity gets them, and they start moving things around. Some other additional components that you can use are what we call digital effects. These are often loaded into auxiliary units or into digital mixers. So you have things like room reverbs, where you can set, you can create individually sized rooms for each channel. So you get, or hopefully for your larger mix as well. So if you want a cathedral-esque kind of reverb, you can set that up. All the way down to a small bedroom. There are some units where you can design the size of your room and it will simulate that. Generally, we don't use that very often in traditional worship settings. We let the room do the work. Maybe a little bit of that in more contemporary services. There are different kinds of delays in which the signal is taken and then sort of chopped up and repeated. Chorus, for example, is something that some people use on guitar effects. They can use it through boards as well, which doubles the sound source to make it sound like a chorus. And then occasionally, very, very rarely, people will use something that's called a flange effect, which makes the sound sort of move up and down in a very interesting audio way. It's not something that you would probably ever want to use in any great fashion. So that's what we do that's what we're working on for our people, for the assembly to be able to hear. Now for musicians, we need to be able to hear as well. And there's three primary ways in which musicians are able to listen to themselves play and listen to one another if they need to do that and the room is not set up for such a thing. So the most contemporary services and applications, there's three different ways we do that. One is through what we call floor wedges, which are speakers that are set on their backs. Often the cabinet, wooden cabinet, is cut so that the speaker projects up to the performer or worship leader. And then in many ways, like we talked about those auxes, those yellow buttons, knobs rather, they can tailor for each musician what they hear. So for example, when I'm playing the bass in a band, I really want to be able to hear the bass drum, the singer, and if I'm playing with the keyboardist, the keyboard, so I make sure that their left hand and what I'm playing don't mess with each other. So that's one piece. There are some challenges to come with wedges because they're often very loud. And in many cases, bands will get into volume wars, and they'll keep pushing things higher and higher and higher so that they can hear themselves better. And then it often gets to the point where there's more sound coming out of the wedges than out of the house sound system. So one of the ways in which that has been fixed is through what we call in-ear monitors, IEMs. And these are headphones that and then a box that usually accompanies the system that allows each musician to pull into their headphone mix what it is that they want to hear. There's some wonderful, they're a great gift for rhythm sections especially. For singers that can be a little complicated because I firmly believe that in a contemporary context the congregation is the fifth member of the band, if you will. And so there are ways in which you can have audio ports built into your in-ears so you can hear a little bit what's happening outside. Often they seal out the sound completely. And then you can also put microphones on people and then run that in, but it gets a little difficult. And there are also little powered monitors that are called hotspots that you'll see in a lot of traditional services. They're very small, maybe a foot long at the most, that you can put on a piano and it actually functions like a wedge. Hope you all are hanging in there. You're doing great on all this good stuff here. There's some essential accessories that you need when you are being mindful of audio work. The first is that you need what's called a cable tester, which you can get from Guitar Center or any kind of online Amazon. They're usually about $30 and they help you to know if your cables are working or if they're broken. 9-volt and AA batteries are essential. Those are the two main kinds of batteries that most sound equipment use. Cable ties, Velcro to be able to tie and keep your cables organized. Scissors for cutting board tape, for all kinds of different things. Board tape itself is a special kind of tape that you can put across the soundboard and then write on a Sharpie. So I know if you're doing lots of different worship pieces, that allows you to quickly write down and help the sound person know what is located where on the board. And then screwdrivers, because a lot of times you got to take stuff apart or put it back together. So what we're going to look at next are microphones and microphone placement. And we'll look at the a variety of different kinds of microphones, wired versus wireless, and microphone placement. All right, so there are a wide variety of microphones. The first of which we call dynamic microphones. The Shure Microphone Company makes the two probably most famous ones. One's known as an SM57. It's the microphone that for about 50 years was used on the podium for the President of the United States when they traveled, and are very, very good on instruments. And then also they make the SM58, which is a wonderful vocal microphone. Those are kind of the gold standards of the industry. They do not require phantom power. They're very tough. But they also, you have to get right next to them to get sound to come out of them. Another option are what we call condenser microphones, and those are generally much more fragile. They come in two varieties, large diaphragm or pencil, which are very small. You can use good for using those on orchestra. Large diaphragm condensers are sort of what you would typically think of as the big microphones that you see in studios. They're wonderful for capturing vocals. And those two require phantom power. Now the next kind is a little bit more exotic. It's a more old-fashioned microphone called a ribbon microphone that is renowned for being very warm in sound. It does not use phantom power, and if you use phantom power on it, often you will destroy the microphone because they are very fragile and don't need extra power going to them. So a note for that. I don't know that too many folks use ribbon microphones, but some will. And then we have what we call lavalier microphones, the kind of microphones that you'd put on a suit jacket or on a dress to help catch speakers' voices. And then we have what we call Countrymans. The Countryman is like the Xerox term, if you will. We all call copiers Xerox machines, right? But it's actually a brand. And that's the microphone that goes around one's ear and points towards the face. It's good for catching speaking specifically. And then we have what are called PZM mics or boundary mics. And those are the kind of microphones that we put in pianos, for example, or that they'll use in theater that catch they're able to catch a wide array of sounds. So let's talk a little bit about microphone placement. You can see in this particular image the miking of a piano. What I'm doing there is using two pencil condenser microphones in what is known as an XY pattern, where they push out to capture treble and bass. So that's one good option. Often most acoustic guitars, for example, we would place a microphone in between the sound hole and the neck. Not on it, of course, but a little far away from it for acoustic guitars. Many of them have pickups in them. You can run them straight into the board, not have to worry about microphones. For electric guitars, we tend to mic amplifiers. That SM57 we were talking about is a great microphone to put on a speaker cabinet. Drums, sort of the traditional way of amplifying drums is to put an overhead condenser mic. One that's often used is known as a Shure SM81, and then putting individual mics on the drums. Dynamic microphones specifically, like SM57s are great for toms and snares, and then they also make bass drum mics, that sort of thing. And we have like obligato instruments, flutes, saxophones, violins. We often will use pencil condensers to catch those instruments because they just give a little bit better image of rich sound. So that was a lot of information in a very short time. One of the things that I'll talk about a little later on is that Google is your friend. There are a wide variety of message boards, instructional opportunities on YouTube, ways to look at how to mic things. So Google is your friend. If it's something that you're looking for, 9 times out of 10, you'll find it on Google. So thanks so much for hanging in with a lot of information in a very short time.